Hello, hello, hello everyone. My name is John Sierra. I am a Tolkien scholar, and I'm here to answer your questions about Tolkien's works. The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, The Children of Húrin, Beren and Luthien, The Fall of Gondolin, The Fall of Númenor, anything you can think of, or just Tolkien himself. And we have lots of questions to get to this time. So we have 18 questions. Let's get right down to it. Okay, first up. Pirates entered Gondor from a port called Harlond at the entrance to the Anduin. Where is Harlond located exactly, and is it reasonable that Aragorn would have traveled this far south in the time provided in the wake of the battle for Minas Tirith? Okay, so, wow, there's a lot wrong with the question itself, so I have to address a few things. The pirates, which were actually called the Corsairs of Umbar, did not attack Minas Tirith. And they didn't really enter Gondor through a port called Harland. There isn't a port called Harland. There's a port called Harlond, and that's actually the port at Minas Tirith. Where the Corsairs of Umbar docked was the Bay of Belfalas, which is much further to the south, and it's near a city called Linhir. So they were waylaid by Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, Elladan and Elrohir were here, a whole bunch of Dunedain. That's the Grey Company. And of course there was the Dead Men of Dunharrow. Most of the pirates, or Corsairs of Umbar, were either slain or driven off. They fled because the Dead Men of Dunharrow struck fear and terror into their hearts. They abandoned their ships. Aragorn took the ships. He freed the slaves that were on board the ships. They joined him, and then he took those ships up the Anduin River towards Harland, which is the port at Minas Tirith. He arrived just in time, basically, to bail everyone out at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. If you think about where Aragorn started and everything, it does seem sort of like really unlikely that he would be able to get there in time, but he got there very quickly by taking the paths of the dead towards Harland. Not towards Harland. See, now you have me doing it. Towards the Bay of Belfalas. And that basically cut straight through the mountains that were there. He didn't have to go around. And then going up the river with the ships, there was a sudden wind that really helped him along. And you can say that that might have been the assistance of the Valar there. So it does make sense. But I just have to say, Harland is at Minas Tirith. That's not where they never made it there. They were planning to go up there, but Aragorn stopped them. Okay. Oh, did that one have a name on it? I sometimes forget. Yes, that one was requested by Jim Wilson. Okay. Next question. This one's anonymous. Did Gollum jump into Mount Doom because before, while Frodo wore the ring, Frodo told Gollum to do so, and Frodo still had authority, though Gollum had taken the ring? Or is it that Gollum fell into Mount Doom accidentally, since Gollum took the ring and Frodo had no power over Gollum? So he didn't jump on purpose. We know that for a fact. He did slip and fall, and he was also kind of pushed in a way. It's a complex answer, but it boils down to both of those things happened. Gollum, to the narrator at the time, which we can understand is Sam. Sam has been the focal character for most of Book 6, and is the one through whose eyes we're seeing these events. Sam was almost certainly focused the most at that point on Frodo. His finger had been bitten off. He was in pain. And sort of in the periphery, you see Gollum dancing with joy because he's recovered his precious. And then suddenly he slips and he's gone. He's in the fire. And so is the ring. Now, it is true that Frodo, when he still had the ring, commanded Gollum using the true power of the One Ring. And what he did command did come to pass. We can also understand that by the words of Galadriel, Frodo didn't really have the power to really use the One Ring in this way. So in the end, we can say that there was a little bit of divine intervention involved in the story. Frodo could never willingly throw the One Ring into the fire. He couldn't do it in Bag End with a fire that he knew would not harm the ring. So how could he do it here? that amount of willpower to actually let go of it and to cast it into the fire, I don't think anybody had that. And I think that Tolkien was very clear that that's basically impossible. It's the ring's power is so seductive and so overwhelming that outside of perhaps maybe the Valar, certainly nobody in Middle-earth could have done this. But he succeeded in a very important thing. He got the ring to Samath Naur. Ilúvatar did the rest, giving Gollum a little nudge. So Tolkien once wrote that if there was a situation where somebody could willingly destroy the ring, that person was actually Gollum, because his indomitable hatred of Sauron was greater than anything. Now, this specific scenario, it was a hypothetical. It involved a lot of variables. He would have had to grown close to Frodo, and he would have had to have been treated differently by Faramir. But even in this hypothetical, Gollum still wouldn't have thrown the ring in. He would have thrown himself and the ring in still. Nobody could just toss it in. So Frodo's mission was to get the ring to Mount Doom. Gollum's part to play was to get the ring into the fire. And Tolkien was very clear in his letters that it was Ilúvatar that stepped in and made sure that that happened. Frodo's command might have invoked Ilúvatar in some way, but it wasn't the power of the ring. Because that's Sauron's power, if you think about it. And if we were to believe that that's the case, then we could say that Sauron is the one who destroyed the ring, and that doesn't really make sense. Okay, next up, another anonymous one. Why does the One Ring make people fight over it? So Gandalf said it best. Only one person can wear a ring. Two people can't wear a ring. There is only one Lord of the Ring, and it's his power, and his power alone. It's Sauron's. It's nobody else's. It cannot be shared. It cannot be used for purposes that are not Sauron's purposes. The belief that you could wield it for good or directly against its master, or even wield it for evil but not in the way that Sauron wants you to, that's the folly that many fell to in the story. Saruman believed he could use the ring, for example, to defeat Sauron, and he tried to get Gandalf on his side. Constantly, he kept using the words, we, what we can do. And I'm going to read a passage from The Lord of the Rings, what Gandalf's reply was. Saruman, I said, standing away from him, only one hand at a time can wield the ring, and you know that well, so do not trouble to say we. But I would not give it. Nay, I would not give even news of it to you now that I learn your mind. You were head of the council, but you have unmasked yourself at last. Well, the choices are, it seems, to submit to Sauron or to yourself. I will take neither. Have you any others to offer? He was cold now and perilous. Yes, he said. I did not expect you to show wisdom, even on your own behalf. But I gave you the chance of aiding me willingly, and so saving yourself much trouble and pain. The third choice is to stay here until the end. Until what end? Until you reveal to me where the one may be found. I may find means to persuade you, or until it is found in your despite, and the ruler has had time to turn to lighter matters, to devise, say, a fitting reward for the hindrance and insolence of Gandalf the Grey. That may not prove to be one of the lighter matters, said I. He laughed at me, for my words were empty, and he knew it. The seductive power of the ring does not allow you to share it. Even Frodo and Sam, upon Sam's suggestion of sharing the burden, it didn't work. Frodo was suddenly stricken with a vision of Sam as an orc, and he reacted in a violent way until that passed. So the ring only has one master, and it cannot be shared by anyone, or even properly used by anyone but Sauron. Okay. Next question, let's see. All right. Why does Sauron fear Gandalf but not the Balrog? I don't think Sauron was necessarily aware of the Balrog. He probably knew there was something really nasty in Moria, and it was sort of working for him. But if he knew there was a Balrog there, he would have been delighted by that, actually. He wouldn't have been afraid of the Balrog. In the First Age, Sauron was the chief lieutenant of Morgoth's army, and he was in charge of all of the forces of Morgoth's army, and this included Balrogs. There were 7 Balrogs, and Sauron was sort of their commanding officer in a way. In the Third Age, Sauron certainly didn't have any Balrogs in his army, or anything that even approached that level of power. His most feared and powerful servant was the Witch King, who, certainly was fearsome, but in the end he was a human sorcerer who was made into a wraith by the power of the Nine. If Sauron discovered that Durin's Bane, the thing in Moria, was a Balrog, he probably would have sent someone there, or maybe even shown up himself and treated with the Balrog and brought it to Mordor. He was not afraid of it. He loved to team up with something so powerful again, and I think that the Balrog would have loved to have stretched its non-existent wings, so to speak, and caused some real mayhem, just like the old days. Okay, next up. Who brought Gandalf back to life in The Lord of the Rings, and why is Gandalf 2.0 much more powerful? I like that, Gandalf 2.0. Gandalf was sent back by the One, he who is alone, Eru Ilúvatar. Ilúvatar is the supreme creator of Tolkien's legendarium and the final authority on all things. And it was Ilúvatar's authority and power that sent Gandalf back, with additional power and authority of his own. As you say, Gandalf 2.0 was referred to as Tolkien as Gandalf the White. And he was basically Saruman's replacement. Gandalf said the exact words himself was Saruman as he should have been. Gandalf is the wisest wizard. He's the bravest wizard, though he was the least in power and splendor, at least from the observations of Cirdan, who watched the wizards come to Middle-earth. But he proved himself, and he was rewarded with additional power, and he replaced Saruman as the White Wizard, the leader of the Astari, and the head of the White Council as well. Okay. All right, next question. Why didn't the other heroes try to pull Gandalf up when he was holding onto the ledge after the Balrog fell in Fellowship of the Ring? Okay, so the movie certainly made it seem like Gandalf was holding on for a while. But even in this case, they weren't able to help him. They were too far away. And if you remember, orcs were also shooting arrows at them. He had only time to deliver his line, "Fly, you fools," and then he slipped away. That was at the center of the bridge, where he had broken it with his staff. The Fellowship was at the end of the bridge. So even if someone like, say, Aragorn had suddenly leapt forward, Gandalf still would have fell. So in the book, let's talk about the book, of course, it was even faster than that. Gandalf was dragged down by the Balrog's whip, and he was not able to hold on very long. I'm going to read you the relevant passage because it's very important to read the order of events here. With a terrible cry, the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. But even as it fell, it swung its whip, and the thongs lashed and curled about the wizard's knees, dragging him to the brink. He staggered and fell, grasped vainly at the stone, and slid into the abyss. "Fly, you fools," he cried, and was gone. So, let's pay special attention to the order of events here. He slid into the abyss before saying his line, meaning that he said it on the way down. So, for the purposes of a film, it's almost always better to show the actor's face. So, the whole thing of Gandalf grasping vainly at the stone was sort of embellished a bit. And if you think about it, if they followed the book exactly, then the Balrog would have been hanging there too by the whip. But in the movie, you saw that the whip went around Gandalf's legs. He was dragged into the chasm. The whip sort of falls away, and then he's sort of grappling. He says the line, and then he slips out. So Either way, there was not enough time. Even with him staying there for maybe 3 seconds, there wasn't enough time. And keep in mind, like I said, there were orcs all around. They were shooting arrows. And Gandalf is telling them, fly, you fools. Not fly with the eagles, as in run with great haste away from here. I'm sacrificing myself so that you can get away. You're more important. Frodo's with you. The ring is with you. Go. If they would have stopped to try and help him, they probably all would have been killed, realistically. Okay. Next up. Why did Legolas shoot Grima when Grima stabbed Saruman if Grima looked like he was going to leave Saruman? Okay, so this is the movie. It doesn't seem to make sense that Legolas killed Grima. Certainly Grima had just killed one of the wizards in front of him, but it was Saruman. And this was probably a good thing. Grima could have defected, and he could have told them a lot of good information, especially about Saruman and his plans and his contact with Sauron and everything. The real reason that they had Legolas do this is because they kind of had to. Grima dies in the book. It's a different location, it's a different circumstance, but he's still shot with an arrow. So let me tell you what happens in the book. In the book, Grima did not stab Saruman at Orthanc, and he never actually appeared in that scene. Instead, the only thing that Grima did was he hurled the Palantir from a higher window, which suggests that he wasn't even on the same level of the tower as Saruman. From the description of the scene, it's actually unclear who Grima was aiming at. He may have been aiming at Gandalf, or he might even have been aiming at Saruman, because the stone skipped off the balcony where Saruman had stood a second earlier before it came all the way down. So Saruman was locked inside the tower by Gandalf, and Treebeard kept a watchful eye on him for a little while. Treebeard eventually figured Saruman was sorry and let him out. He did admit this to Gandalf and said he's not in the habit of being a jailkeeper. So the Fellowship met Saruman and Grima on the road home in Dunland, and they appeared to be wandering beggars at this point, and none of the Fellowship that was there were really all that concerned with them. Merry even gave Saruman some pipeweed when he asked for it. However, they were only in disguise as beggars. Saruman had been in the process of taking over the Shire, with Lotho Sackville Baggins as his sort of puppet. When Grima wound up murdering Lotho on Saruman's orders, but they were still giving orders in his name. And he likely did not eat Lotho. That's something that Saruman brought up. He said that, I'm going to go into that in a bit, actually. I'll come back to that. I'm going to circle back to that. So the scouring of the Shire happens. They free the Shire. Frodo insists at this point that Saruman be turned out of the Shire and not killed. Many of the hobbits were keen on revenging themselves on him. Frodo also asked Grima to stay. He says, you don't have to follow him. He treats you very poorly. He's always kicking you. He's cursing you. He treats you like less than a dog. You have done no great evil. You can stay. Saruman got very angry, and this is when he revealed that Grima had killed Lotho Sackville Baggins, and of course Grima's like, what are you talking? You told me to do that. That was under your orders. And Saruman sort of replies by sort of suggesting that Grima might have eaten Lotho. Now, I don't think he did, because Saruman is a liar, and he's lying. He doesn't want to lose the one servant that he has left here. But Grima snaps. Grima's had enough of the abuse and the curses and the lies, suggesting that he's a cannibal. So he suddenly jumps up on Saruman's back, he cuts his throat from behind, and then he tries to flee down the road. Now, Frodo would have been happy to let him go at this point, but before Frodo can even say anything, he's shot to death by some hobbit archers. So, leaving out the whole scouring of the Shire bit from the films, and also deciding to film death scenes for Saruman and for Grima, even if they weren't used in the theatrical cut, they were eventually released in the extended cut, they went with sort of a broad strokes adaptation of the scene. It happens at Orthanc instead of the Shire, but still the basic idea is Grima kills Saruman with a knife, and then somebody shoots Grima with an arrow, And in this situation, Legolas is the guy with the arrow because he's there. Personally, I think the scene would have looked better if after this, Gandalf turned to Legolas and said something like that wasn't really necessary, But that's my opinion. Okay, next question. Another anonymous. Most of them are anonymous, but that's perfectly fine. Did Tolkien really write The Lord of the Rings as a way to use the Elvish language he came up with, or was it two different projects coming together? It is, as you said, two different projects coming together. The Lord of the Rings started as nothing more than a sequel to The Hobbit. It was requested by his fans, it was requested by his children, and it was especially requested by his publisher. So at the same time, he was working on a bunch of other things. The mythology that would become the backbone of his constructed languages, Quenya, Sindarin, Telerin. And he had these stories. He had the Children of Húrin, he had Beren and Lúthien, he had the Fall of Gondolin, and he also had a big work to sort of tie it together, all of the stories, into one that he called the Silmarillion. That was the cornerstone of his mythology. Now, when he's writing The Lord of the Rings, he reused some of the names from the Silmarillion. Glorfindel's an example. There was a character named Glorfindel in The Fall of Gondolin in the Silmarillion, and there was a character named Glorfindel in Book 1 of The Lord of the Rings, which he was writing at the same time. And then he changed his mind, and they're the same guy, and it's all one big story. And this is how the Legendarium came to be, where The Lord of the Rings is connected to the Silmarillion, and retroactively, The Hobbit is now connected as well. So, using the example of Glorfindel, though, it actually winds up making everything kind of better and shaping the mythology, because now he's like, well, wait a minute, I killed off Glorfindel in the Silmarillion, he dies in the Fall of Gondolin. How do I explain that he's there in Lord of the Rings, which is much, much later? And this is where he came up with the idea that elves aren't just immortal, but they're undying. If their bodies are killed, they can return. So they never pass away fully. So yeah, it was originally its own separate thing. It wasn't really connected to the philological, linguistic work, but it became that after a time. It was really, like you said, two different projects that came together. Okay. Next question. This one was requested by Yusuf Khan, who asks, in The Lord of the Rings, were the Palantir stones sort of a precursor to the Rings of Power? Both seem to be something with a lot of power, but make you evil. So, no, not at all. They're nothing alike. The Palantir don't actually make you evil. I can understand how you'd come to that conclusion, but it's not the case. The Palantir, the Seeing Stones, or multiple ones, there's the Palantiri, that's the way we pluralize it. We don't know who really made them, but it's likely that they were made by Feanor. And they were a communication device. They have no properties for good or for evil, they are just a tool. So saying that a Palantir made someone evil is sort of like saying a website made somebody evil. Like perhaps somebody went to a website and they saw evil things or they read evil things, but don't they have a choice to reject those notions? So in the end, you can't say that, well, the website did it, right? So you can't really say that the Palantir makes you evil when it's just showing you things. The Palantir of Middle-earth were brought there by Elendil from Numenor, and they were used by kings and very important leaders to survey the land and to communicate instantly across long distances. There are three that are important to the narrative of The Lord of the Rings. There's the Orthanc Stone, the Ithil Stone, and the Anor Stone. Now, the issue with making that assumption that the Palantiri makes you evil is we look at which characters have these three stones. The Orthanc Stone, Saruman has. The Ithil Stone, Sauron has. And the Anor Stone, Denethor has. So we have the Dark Lord, we have a corrupted wizard, and we have a mad steward. It should be noted that Saruman's evil was mostly due to his ambitions and his pride. Using the Palantir didn't help because he wound up communing with Sauron. But it wasn't the stone, it was Sauron that tipped him fully into madness, but he was already on his way there. Denethor had been using the stone secretly for a very long time. Perhaps as soon as he became steward, he started using it. And this is why he knew so many things. He was always somebody who knew things that he really... I'm not going to say he shouldn't have known those things, but there was no way for him to know these things, which is why the assumption was made when it was revealed that he had been using the Palantir, that he had probably been using it for quite a long time. And he also wound up communing with Sauron, and he was driven to madness by Sauron, not by the stone. So Aragorn also used the Orthanc stone to commune with Sauron, but he's the king. He is actually the true owner of the Palantiri. That stone, we'll say legally, belonged to him. He's the rightful owner. So he was able to wrest control of the stone from Sauron. And Aragorn in the Fourth Age used it quite a bit. He never became evil. He looked out onto his kingdom. He surveyed the lands. He used it for its intended purposes. So, like I said, it's just a tool. It doesn't make you evil. It can be used for evil. And if you are somebody like Sauron, you can certainly use it to seduce other people because it is a communications tool, or to drive other people mad if that's something within your power. But it's not the stones themselves. So they're not really like the Rings of Power. Okay. Next question. In The Lord of the Rings, why wasn't Radagast the Brown asked to come to the White Council meetings about the Necromancer or the One Ring if he was a wizard and could be asked to use his powers to help? So we don't actually know that Radagast wasn't on the council, to be honest. The original iteration of the White Council was created in the Second Age by Galadriel, and it was made up of those deemed to be the wise. Aside from Galadriel, they didn't really mention a whole lot of other members, but we can assume Elrond, Gil-galad, Celeborn, Cirdan. Gil-galad was said to pass the Ring of Power that he had to Elrond at one of the White Council meetings, and it was said that there were other lords of the Eldar present. The Third Age version of the Council contained Galadriel and Elrond as well, and we can assume Cirdan and Celeborn were there as well, and perhaps some other elves, but leadership of the new council was ceded by Galadriel to... Initially, she wanted Gandalf, actually. She wanted Gandalf to be the leader, but Saruman sort of pulled rank. He insisted that he's the head of the Astari, so he should be the head of the council. Gandalf wasn't putting up a fight. He didn't want to hear about it, so... because those two wizards were there, we can assume that Radagast may have been there as well, but a full membership of the Council of the White was never revealed. Okay. All right, next question is from Adam Machin, who says, if Gandalf the White was Saruman as he should have been, does that mean Saruman should have been a leader of men on the front line fighting? Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Saruman should have been out there fighting with everybody else, but he thought he was above all that. Saruman scorned the friendship of men, and he really only cared for the elves. And he couldn't understand why the elves loved Gandalf more. But we can easily see it's because Gandalf was out there making an effort. He was walking amongst men, dwarves, elves, hobbits, and actually trying to befriend the races, where Saruman was just the sort of guy who just expected adoration simply because he was the White Wizard. So thinking on it, Saruman may have won at Helm's Deep if he had actually bothered to show up. Instead, he let his sort of badly trained and ill-armed army do the work for him, and of course, we know they failed. He was sitting in his tower the whole time. Now, in this way, he's not that dissimilar to Sauron. Sauron does the same thing, but at least Sauron, in times of desperation, would take to the field of battle, whereas Saruman, we never hear of him doing that. So it's absolutely true that actually being a leader on the field, an inspiration, and a friend, that's the functions of the White Wizard. Saruman rejected these functions. He was more interested in artifacts than he was in people. Okay, next question. So, hold on one second. Okay, just realized I couldn't see the time on this. Okay, why did Cirdan give Narya the Ring of Fire to Gandalf instead of Saruman? kind of everything I said up until this point about those two. But yeah, there's a bunch of different versions of the story of the wizards arriving in Middle-earth. They may have come anywhere from somewhere vaguely in the Second Age to 1000 of the Third Age or thereabouts. They may have all arrived at the same time. They may have arrived staggered. In some versions of the story, the first wizards to arrive were Saruman and Radagast. In some, it was just Saruman by himself. It's usually mentioned that Gandalf came last. Sometimes the blue wizards came first and then Saruman later. There's a lot of different versions of it. But what we know is that Cirdan did indeed pass the Ring of Power to Gandalf. Now, in the book Unfinished Tales of Númenor and Middle-earth, it does tell about how Cirdan came to give the ring to Gandalf. And in this version of the story, Cirdan seemed to suggest that all the wizards arrived at the same time. And he mentioned that the chief among them was raven-haired and tall with a fair voice. Now, this is Saruman. Cirdan notes that he was wise and he was skillful, but his eyes were not drawn to Saruman. They were drawn to Gandalf. He didn't have the name Gandalf yet, but he called him the Grey One. He seemed the least. He was not as tall as the others. He was humble. He even appeared to be older than the rest, and he was bent, white, leaning on a staff. Despite these outwards appearances of Gandalf being the least powerful, the least impressive, Cirdan was able to sense Gandalf's power and his wisdom, more importantly, and he revered him. He felt that he was unworthy of the Ring of Power, and it should be given to someone more nobler than he, and he chose Gandalf, stating that it will give him aid and comfort. Now, despite his observations, this might have been a simple matter of elvish foresight. Cirdan was wise, and he may have felt that Gandalf should receive the ring because he needed to, because he had need of it. But either way, that's basically in the version of the story where we hear directly about Cirdan handing the ring to Gandalf. It was his observations that his eyes were drawn to him, and that he felt a special connection to Gandalf. Okay, next question. What is the meaning of Galadriel in Quenya? So Galadriel's not a Quenya name. It's her Sindarin name, actually. In Sindarin, Galadriel is not properly glossed, but Tolkien gave several different translations of the name Galadriel, most of which seem to be derived from the Sindarin words for maiden, crown, and garland. So it gives us such name translations as maiden crowned with a garland of bright radiance, or the more simple maiden crowned with gleaming hair. One moment. So it should be mentioned that Galadriel is her after-name. Elves have a mother name, a father name, and sometimes also an after-name. Usually the way it works was the mother gives the elf a name at birth. The father gives a name later on, and that tends to be more of a description of the person that they have become. And then the after-name is sort of like a title or a nickname that they've taken on. Now, the name Galadriel was the after-name. Her mother name was Artanis, and her father name was Nurwen. These are both Quenya. Artanis means noble woman, and Nurwen means man-maiden. And that seems a little weird to call her man-maiden, but it was given because she was very, very tall. She was taller even than most elf men were. So the name Galadriel is likely cinderized from her Telerin after-name given to her by her husband Celeborn, which was Alatariel. So her husband, who spoke Telerin, called her Alatariel. She cinderized that to Galadriel. If you want to know what Galadriel would be in Quenya, it would be Naltariel. So basically to answer the question, the meaning of Galadriel does refer to maiden crowned with a garland of radiance or something like that, something very similar, but it's not Quenya. Okay. The new Gollum game is not popular. What is your opinion about it as a Tolkien fan? Wow, okay. At first, I was kind of excited about this game. It's an odd idea, but it's interesting. It's unique. It's something that we haven't seen before, and I was very interested to play it. Then I started hearing some things. Before the game even came out, I was hearing things that were bothering me. The DLC policy was the biggest one. They were selling DLC on day one, and I really don't like that, because anything that you're releasing on day one should be part of the game. Unless it's something like like a season pass where you're buying future DLC that is going to come out. But the two things they announced were a Sindarin language pack, which should have 100% been part of the main game. And the other thing that really boggles the mind is an emote pack, which doesn't make sense because Gollum is a single-player game. There's no online component to it. So why would you get an emote pack? What's the point of it? Why would you pay for that? So my interest was waning hard. And then it got released, and the reviews came out, and it was said to be a very buggy, poorly optimized mess. The graphics were downgraded from what we had seen previously. The physics are weird. Instead of designing the levels around the character's ability, they just plopped Gollum into a world, so sometimes to make a jump, he suddenly grows longer to make the animation. It's very visually strange to see. It's just weird. Maybe one day I'll play it on Twitch, on a Twitch stream, if it winds out like being sold for very cheap, like on a sale or something, and to just see. I mean, I streamed the Super Nintendo game, The Lord of the Rings Volume 1, and that was pretty bad. Do I have it sitting around here? I know it's somewhere around here, but oh, there it is. Yeah. I have the Super Nintendo game, and I bought this when I was, a teenager, because I saw it. I was like, oh, there's a Lord of the Rings game, and I didn't know about it, and I was like, oh, I love the Lord of the Rings, I gotta get this. Spent $60 on it, and it's not good. It's not good, and I did stream through that recently. Finally finished it after all these years, but yeah, the Gollum thing, I don't know. That's, it's a mess of a game, and for me personally, I lost my interest pretty early on due to the way they were handling DLC. Not a good sign of things to come. Okay. Alright, so the next question is, let's see, this was asked by Mark Wagonar. What is the living rock Gandalf spoke of in The Lord of the Rings, where the endless stair ends at Xeraxagil, the pinnacle of the Silver Time? Earlier in the book, before the party had decided to traipse through Moria, we learned that in Tolkien's world, mountains are alive, or at least it is believed to be so by both dwarf and elf. Celebdil, also known as Xeraxagil in the dwarves' language, is a mountain. It's one of the Misty Mountains, but let's talk about one of the other Misty Mountains, Carathras. The dwarves would call that Baranzibar. The Fellowship tried to cross a pass at Carathras earlier, but they were foiled by a terrible blizzard. Now, in the movie version, it showed that this sudden storm was conjured by Saruman to force the party into Moria, where they would face a Balrog. In the book, Saruman had no such investment in this scene at all, and he certainly was not aware that Durin's Bane was a Balrog. And though some people would believe that Sauron was the one that caused the blizzard, Gimli had a different opinion. Gimli thought that the mountain itself was alive, and all mountains were alive, and that it had its own will, and that Carathras in particular was not very accepting of travelers. How much of this is true, we don't know, but we know that nobody really said anything to refute Gimli's assertion that the mountain itself caused the blizzard. But there is one thing that points in the direction that Gimli was correct, and that is the words and actions of Legolas. At one point in the story, Legolas, and keep in mind he's barely a character at this point, he's barely said two words to anyone, but Legolas answers Gandalf regarding the elves who once lived in Harlond. I'm going to read you a passage here from The Lord of the Rings. "That is true," said Legolas, "but the elves of this land were of a race strange to us of the Sylvan folk, and the trees and the grass do not now remember them. Only I hear the stones lament them. Deep they delved us, fair they wrought us, high they builded us, but they are gone. They are gone. they sought the havens long ago. Legolas speaks of the strangeness of the Harlond elves who have since sailed west, and he says he can hear the voices of the stones, lamenting that they were dug and delved to make dwellings for the elves, but then the elves abandoned the stones and left. Legolas speaks to rocks, or at least he hears the voices of rocks. This seems to go along with what Gimli said, that stone is actually alive. Mountains may even be sentient. So Gandalf doesn't say anything to refute this. He doesn't say anything to refute Gimli. He doesn't say anything to refute Legolas. And then he described living rock in the bowels below Moria, so he's pretty much saying that they are, in fact, correct. Okay. Next question. What caused Saruman to diminish to just an old man in the Shire? Was Gandalf responsible, or was it expending his power doing evil acts? Gandalf was responsible in a way, but of course the true power behind Saruman's depletion of ability was Iluvatar. So Saruman's great powers were gone at this point. Only his voice was left to him. And that's not really magic, it's charisma, it's persuasion. Think of it this way. All of the wizards are doing the bidding of the Valar. But even though they are servants of the Valar, they are also servants of the One, Iluvatar. Gandalf said as much in Moria. He said he was a servant of the secret fire. That refers to the flame imperishable, the light of creation within Iluvatar. When Gandalf died, he went to the Timeless Halls, and he returned as the White Wizard. Then he essentially fired Saruman under the authority of God himself. He broke his staff and cast him out of the order. Now, this was an authority given by Iluvatar and may have extended only specifically to firing Saruman. I mean, it wasn't like Gandalf was going around firing any wizard that didn't, fulfill their goals or put in their TPS reports or whatever. So think of Saruman as being fired from being a wizard, and Gandalf is the manager that was told to do this. Saruman hinted towards the hobbits of the Shire that he still had great power and he could call upon magic, but Frodo was like, nope, no you can't, and he assured everyone that Saruman had no great power, he had no magic left other than his voice, and if you were forewarned, you were forearmed. You could resist his persuasion if you were aware of it. Okay, next question. Let's see. Was Galadriel exaggerating when she described the powers that she would have with the One Ring? She makes it sound like she would be almighty and stronger than Sauron ever was. In a way, she may have been deceived herself, although not to her detriment. The ring is known to fill people's heads and their hearts with delusions of grandeur and great power. It could it could give them power, obviously, but it would always make it seem like it could give them all the power they wanted. This is essentially what happened to Boromir. He went on ranting and raving about all the things he could do if he could just have the One Ring. And as we see with Boromir, the ring does not need to be held by that person for it to affect them. They just need to be nearby. Even humble Sam Gamgee was given a vision of himself as a great hero who turns all of Middle-earth into a garden. Galadriel may have been correct with her assumptions and everything that she said, or maybe she was deceived. But either way, what's important is that she rejected it, because maybe she realized that it was false, or maybe she thought it was true, but she didn't want that in the end. But I think there's a different point to telling Frodo this, because she is doing something very important. She's getting him to stop offering the One Ring up to anybody and everybody that seems good to him. Eventually, someone might take him up on that offer. At this point in the story, Frodo has offered it to Gandalf, to Elrond, and to Aragorn. We're not even out of the first volume, and Frodo is offering it up to a fourth person now. So Galadriel gives Frodo a better understanding of the nature of the One Ring than anybody else previously had. And if we notice, from this point onwards, he doesn't offer it to anybody else. Okay. Final question. And let's see, what is it? Here it is. Oh, I like this one. Is it pretentious for Legolas to call the other members of the Fellowship children, if justified by his extreme age? I think it could come off as pretentious and demeaning, or it could come off as lighthearted, playful, and, endearing. It depends on when in the story would Legolas say such a thing. If Legolas said this sort of right out the gate, right after starting the journey, I think that he would have come off badly. Aragorn was 87 years old. Perhaps by Elvish standards, that's a child or early adolescent. But he's not an elf. He's a man, and it was the tradition of the men of Numenor that they came of age at 25, and he's 87. Gimli was 139 years old. By the standards of his race, he's also a full adult. You might even say that he's middle-aged at this point. However, Legolas didn't say this at the beginning. He said this much later. He had already become best friends with Gimli and very close friends with Aragorn as well. He was not being serious. And I think a lot of people tend to read The Lord of the Rings as being very grim and very serious and weighty, and they sort of miss the levity that's there, the humor in the work. Legolas was having a joke at the expense of his friends, and they didn't indicate any offense. They all knew each other pretty well at this point. Good question, though. I enjoyed that one. Okay, so that's actually it. We got through 18 questions in kind of record time. Some of these were pretty simple questions. I don't mind simple questions, of course, but not a lot of the long, rambling ones that I had last week for sure. Anyway, we're going to see you guys next week. Please like the video. Please comment on the video. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and help me out here. We'll see you guys next week.